Hey there, incredible listeners. It means the world to have you here. Because you're the kind of people who know that every great story carries a powerful lesson. Today's story will shake you. A store where employees struggle under suffocating toxic leadership, a CEO who goes undercover not just to observe but to truly understand the pain his workers endure. What he uncovered shattered him, what he did next changed lives forever. This is a story of betrayal, redemption. Jonathan Wilson had always prided himself on being a hands-on leader. As the founder and CEO of Wilson's Hardware, a once thriving family-run store, he had built his business from the ground up with hard work, dedication, and a deep commitment to his employees and customers. But lately, something felt off. Sales had been slipping in certain locations, customer complaints were rising, and employee turnover was at an all-time high. Every time he brought up these concerns with his corporate team, he was met with reassurances and neatly packaged reports that painted a rosy picture. Yet, something deep inside him told him the numbers weren't telling the full story. Frustrated and eager for the truth, Jonathan made a bold decision. He would go undercover. If his team wouldn't be honest with him from behind a corporate desk, he'd find out firsthand what was really happening inside his store. With the help of a close friend, a professional makeup artist, he transformed into Mike, a middle-aged man with graying hair, glasses, and a slightly disheveled look. Dressed in worn jeans, an old flannel shirt, and work boots, he looked nothing like the sharp, well-dressed CEO he was in real life. Even though most of his store employees had never met him in person, his disguise would ensure that no one suspected his true identity. Jonathan chose one of the company's struggling locations, a hardware store on the outskirts of town, known for its declining sales and mixed customer reviews. The store had once been one of his top-performing locations, but lately, complaints about rude service, unhelpful employees, and poor management had been piling up. He needed to see for himself whether the problem was with the staff, the leadership, or something bigger. Walking into Wilson's Hardware on a chilly Monday morning, Jonathan braced himself for whatever he was about to uncover. He was determined to be just another new stock assistant, hired for minimum wage and eager to learn. The plan was simple: observe, listen, and find the truth. But what he didn't realize was that what he was about to witness would change not only his company, but also his entire approach to leadership forever. Jonathan Wilson took a deep breath as he stepped into Wilson's Hardware, the store he had once been proud of, but now barely recognized. The aisles were cluttered with misplaced inventory, the shelves looked haphazardly stocked, and there was an air of disinterest among the employees. A few workers milled about, some engaged in idle chatter, while others scrolled on their phones behind the counter. This wasn't the hard-working, customer-first environment he had built years ago. Something was seriously wrong. Dressed as Mike, the new stock assistant, Jonathan walked up to the front register, where a stern-looking woman with a name tag that read Karen, store manager, was flipping through a clipboard. She barely looked up as he approached. "You must be the new guy," she muttered, not bothering to shake his hand. "You're on stocking duty. Don't get in the way, don't ask too many questions, and don't slow us down." Jonathan nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He was here to observe, not argue. Karen handed him a name tag without another word and walked away, barking instructions at a cashier who was struggling with a malfunctioning register. His first task? Stocking the lumber section. Jonathan made his way toward the back of the store, where he found Nate, a teenage stock worker, unloading a shipment of heavy wooden planks. The kid barely looked up as Jonathan approached. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his workload. "You new?" Nate asked, glancing at him. "Yeah," Jonathan said. "Mike just started today." Nate nodded but didn't say much more, clearly too tired or uninterested to make conversation. As they worked together, Jonathan noticed something. Nate was putting in real effort, moving efficiently and handling tasks that seemed far beyond his role, yet no one acknowledged his hard work. Instead, Karen's voice cut through the store like a whip as she scolded another employee near the register. At the checkout counter, Dave, an older cashier, was leaning on the counter, scrolling through his phone while customers waited in line. Karen stormed over, yelling loudly enough for customers to hear. "Dave, if you actually did your job instead of playing on your phone, we wouldn't have people waiting." Dave barely reacted, rolling his eyes before moving sluggishly to scan the next customer's items. His indifference was evident, and Jonathan could see why. There was no motivation, no teamwork, just a toxic cycle of blame. Jonathan spent the next few hours quietly observing the store's rhythm, noticing the clear divide between those who worked hard and those who had checked out. The biggest problem, however, wasn't laziness. It was a culture of fear, where employees either avoided Karen or simply stopped caring. As his shift went on, Jonathan started to realize the real root of the store's decline wasn't the employees themselves. It was leadership, and Karen was at the center of it. Jonathan had already seen enough red flags to confirm that something was deeply wrong at Wilson's Hardware, but what happened next made his blood boil. He was straightening a shelf near the checkout area when he heard Karen's sharp voice cutting through the store. "Sophie, what's taking you so long? You're holding up the line." Jonathan turned toward the registers and saw Sophie, a young cashier, standing frozen in place. She looked barely 20, her face pale and her hands shaking as she tried to scan a customer's items. The elderly woman at the counter sighed impatiently, tapping her fingers against the register. "I'm sorry," Sophie stammered, blinking quickly, as if trying to hold back tears. "You're always sorry," Karen snapped, her voice loud enough that nearby customers turned to watch. "Maybe if you spent less time messing up and more time actually working, we wouldn't have this problem." Jonathan clenched his fists. Humiliating an employee in front of customers? That was unacceptable. Sophie bit her lip, her hands trembling as she struggled to finish the transaction. The elderly customer sighed again, muttering, "Maybe you should find someone who actually knows what they're doing." Jonathan saw the moment Sophie broke. She turned her face away, blinking furiously, to keep the tears from falling. Before he could step in, Karen stormed closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Sophie could hear. "I don't care what your excuse is today," she hissed. "If you can't handle this job, maybe you should quit." Sophie barely managed to whisper, I need this job." Karen crossed her arms. "Then act like it." That was it. Jonathan had seen enough. As Karen walked away, Jonathan watched Sophie quickly wipe her eyes and force a smile as she greeted the next customer. He knew that kind of smile, the kind people put on when they had no choice but to push through. He wasn't just dealing with bad management, he was dealing with a toxic workplace that was breaking people. During the lunch break, Jonathan found Sophie sitting alone in the break room, staring down at her untouched sandwich. He sat across from her, keeping his voice gentle. "Hey, you okay?" Sophie flinched slightly, then forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You don't look fine," Jonathan said. She hesitated before finally sighing. "It's just, Karen's been on my case for weeks. Nothing I do is good enough." Jonathan leaned forward. "Why do you stay?" Sophie hesitated again before whispering, "My grandmother is sick. I'm all she has. I've been picking up extra shifts to help pay for her medication." She let out a hollow laugh. "But I guess it doesn't matter to Karen. She just thinks I'm slow." Jonathan felt a tight knot in his chest. He knew he couldn't reveal himself yet. But one thing was clear. Sophie wasn't the problem. Karen was. And soon she was going to learn that the hard way. After witnessing Karen's harsh treatment of Sophie, Jonathan knew he needed more than just one incident to justify making major changes. He spent the rest of the day quietly observing how the store functioned, and quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. Employees worked in fear rather than confidence, constantly on edge, avoiding Karen whenever possible. Instead of being a leader, she ruled through intimidation, snapping at workers for the smallest mistakes, while never offering any real guidance or support. The result? A workforce that was either burnt out, disengaged, or completely checked out. Jonathan caught Nate, the hardworking teenage stock assistant, pushing himself past his limits. The kid had been moving heavy boxes all day without a break, yet no one had acknowledged his effort. Jonathan approached him as he rearranged a messy shelf. "Hey, aren't you supposed to be on break?" Jonathan asked. Nate shrugged, adjusting a box. "Yeah, but if I don't fix this, Karen's going to yell at the next person on shift. Might as well save them the trouble." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Employees were covering for each other out of fear of Karen's wrath. That wasn't leadership. That was survival. Later, Jonathan overheard a conversation between Dave, the older cashier, and another employee near the back. "I just stopped caring, man," Dave muttered. "Why bother? You bust your ass here and all you get is yelled at, so I just do what I need to get by." Jonathan wasn't surprised. He had seen this exact attitude in failing businesses before. When employees felt ignored or mistreated, they disengaged completely. The final confirmation came when a customer asked Sophie about a return policy. She politely tried to explain it, but the customer, frustrated, sighed. "Is there someone else I can talk to? You don't seem to know much." Before Sophie could respond, Karen swooped in. "I'll handle this," Karen said curtly, pushing Sophie aside. Once the customer left, she turned on Sophie. "Do you see why I'm always on your case?" Karen sneered. "You embarrass this store." Jonathan had seen enough. This wasn't just a bad day. It was a broken system. Employees were overworked, underappreciated, and treated like liabilities instead of assets. It was time to step in. And Karen? She was about to find out who she'd really been talking to. Jonathan had reached his breaking point. Karen's toxic leadership wasn't just an isolated issue. It was destroying the entire store. He had spent the past 2 days watching good employees burn out, hardworking staff go unrecognized, and customers receive poor service because of one person's mismanagement. It was time to put an end to it. The final straw came during another humiliating encounter at the front counter. A frustrated customer snapped at Sophie over a minor issue, and before she could explain, Karen stepped in, not to support her, but to belittle her. "Do you even listen when I talk to you?" Karen hissed. "Or do you just enjoy embarrassing yourself?" That was it. Jonathan couldn't stay silent any longer. "Karen, that's enough." His voice was steady but firm. Karen turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, who do you think you are?" Jonathan took a deep breath, reached up, and pulled off his glasses. Then he peeled away the edges of his fake beard, revealing his true identity. "I'm Jonathan Wilson," he said, his voice carrying through the store. "I own this company." A stunned silence fell over the room. Sophie gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. Nate froze in place while Dave straightened up, suddenly very interested in what was happening. Even customers in line turned to watch. Karen's face went pale, then red. You're the owner?" she stammered. "Yes," Jonathan said, stepping forward. "And I've spent the last 2 days watching how you run this store. The way you treat these employees, it's unacceptable." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm just trying to get results," she muttered defensively. "These kids are lazy. If I don't push them, nothing gets done." Jonathan shook his head. "That's not leadership. That's bullying. And it's failing. Your best employees are exhausted, your customers are unhappy, and the store's reputation is crumbling." Karen looked away, her jaw tight. She had no excuse. Jonathan sighed. "I'm giving you a choice," he said. "You can either take a leave of absence effective immediately, or you can resign. But you can't stay here. Not like this." Karen's shoulders slumped. She exhaled sharply. "Fine, I'll resign." Jonathan gave her a firm nod. "I'll make sure you're paid through the end of the month. But I need you to leave today." Without another word, Karen grabbed her bag and walked out. As the door swung shut behind her, Jonathan turned back to the employees, all staring at him in shock. "All right," he said, his voice calm but determined. "Let's fix this store." With Karen gone, the tension in the store felt like a heavy weight had been lifted. But Jonathan knew that firing her wasn't enough. Real change had to happen immediately. He took a deep breath, turned to the employees still gathered near the registers, and addressed them directly. "First, I want to apologize," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "I should have been paying closer attention. What I've seen here over the past 2 days doesn't reflect the kind of company I want to run. That's on me, and I promise you, it changes today." The employees exchanged uncertain glances. Years of working under Karen had taught them to be skeptical, but Jonathan wasn't here to make empty promises. He was here to take action. He turned to Sophie first. "Sophie, I saw how hard you work, even when you weren't being treated fairly. I also know you've been struggling with personal challenges. Starting today, You're getting paid time off to focus on your grandmother. Take the time you need." Sophie's mouth fell open. "Wait, seriously?" she whispered. Jonathan nodded. "You've earned it, and when you're ready to come back, your job will be waiting for you with the respect you deserve." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." Next, Jonathan turned to Nate. "Nate, I've seen your dedication. You step up for others, and that's the kind of leadership this store needs. You're being promoted to assistant supervisor." Nate blinked. "Me? But I'm just a stock guy." "Not anymore," Jonathan said with a smile. "You've shown more leadership than most people twice your age. You deserve this." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the team, and for the first time in a long time there was a glimmer of hope. Jonathan continued, "Now let's talk about what else needs to change." He grabbed a notepad and asked, "What's the biggest thing holding this store back?" Hands slowly went up. Dave, the disengaged cashier, spoke first. "We're always understaffed. We need more people on the floor." "Done," Jonathan said. "I'll work with HR to bring in 2 more employees immediately." Another worker, Carla, added, "We were never trained properly. We're just expected to figure things out on our own." Jonathan nodded. "That changes now. We'll be implementing a real training program so everyone feels confident in their role." Then Sophie, her voice still shaky but stronger, added one last thing. "We need to feel valued, not just when something goes wrong, but when we do something right." Jonathan smiled. "You're absolutely right. Starting today, we're launching an employee recognition program. When someone goes above and beyond, they'll be rewarded. You all deserve that." The employees looked at each other, hopeful but cautious. It would take time to build trust again, but for the first time in years, it felt like things were finally changing for the better. And Jonathan? He had never felt more certain that he was on the right path. Wilson's Hardware wasn't just going to survive, it was going to thrive. The following morning, Jonathan arrived at the store as himself. No disguise, no cover story, just a CEO determined to rebuild trust. The employees, still adjusting to the shock of the previous day, exchanged glances as he walked in. Sophie, though visibly more relaxed, still looked hesitant, clutching a clipboard as if it might shield her. Nate, now in his new assistant supervisor role, gave him a small nod, equal parts gratitude and nerves. "Good morning, everyone," Jonathan said, his tone calm but purposeful. "We're going to have a team meeting to discuss what happens next. Break room, 5 minutes." The employees shuffled in, still unsure of what to expect. As they sat down, Jonathan stood at the front of the room, his notepad in hand. "I know the last couple of days have been a lot," he began. "I want to thank you for your patience and for showing up despite the challenges, but I also want to be honest with you. This store is not where it should be. And that's not just on you, that's on me too. I should have been paying closer attention." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. They weren't used to leadership taking responsibility. "I'm not here to point fingers," Jonathan continued. "I'm here to listen and fix what's broken. So let's start with this. What do you need to make this store a better place to work?" For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Nate spoke up. "We need more support. A lot of us are doing the work of 2 or 3 people. It's exhausting." Sophie hesitated before adding, "And, it's hard to care about the job when it feels like no one cares about us." Jonathan felt the weight of their words settle over the room. He turned to the rest of the team. "Does anyone else feel the same?" One by one, hands went up. Carla, a longtime employee, added, "Every time we tried to bring up concerns before, we were ignored, or worse, punished for speaking up." Jonathan nodded. "That ends today." He grabbed a whiteboard marker. "We're breaking this down into 2 categories, short-term fixes and long-term goals. Let's start with what we can fix right now." One by one, they built a plan together, and for the first time in a long time, Wilson's Hardware felt like a team again. As the meeting wrapped up, something had shifted in the air. The employees, who just days ago had seemed distant, disheartened, and disengaged, now sat up a little straighter, their expressions lighter. There was still caution, still hesitation, but for the first time in a long time, there was also something else. Hope. Jonathan could feel it too. Wilson's Hardware wasn't fixed overnight, but real change had begun. This wasn't just about policies or staffing, this was about culture, and today was the first step in rebuilding it. That afternoon, Jonathan worked alongside his employees, stocking shelves, assisting customers, and making sure that the day-to-day changes they had discussed were already being implemented. There was no more disconnect. He wasn't just a CEO behind a desk, he was part of the team. As he walked past the registers, he saw Sophie, back at the counter, handling customers with confidence. There was no Karen hovering over her, no insults thrown her way. Just a young woman doing her job, and doing it well. "Nate," Jonathan called over, watching as the young man assisted a customer in the tool section. Nate turned quickly, looking half expecting to be reprimanded, but Jonathan smiled. "You're doing a great job," Jonathan said. "How are things feeling so far?" Nate hesitated, then gave a small, genuine nod. "Better. A lot better." That was all Jonathan needed to hear. At the end of the day, Jonathan called a quick huddle near the checkout counters. "I know we've made a lot of changes quickly," he said, his tone warm but firm. "And I also know trust isn't built overnight, but I want you all to know I'm here, I'll be checking in, I'll be listening, and I will make sure this store becomes a place you're proud to work." For the first time, he saw smiles, real ones. As Jonathan locked up the store that night, he took a deep breath and looked back through the glass doors. The employees inside were chatting, smiling, moving with energy that hadn't been there before. The store wasn't perfect yet, but it was on its way. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like the leader his company needed. As Jonathan walked into his office the next morning, he felt different, not as the CEO of a company, but as a leader who had finally reconnected with the heart of his business. Wilson's Hardware had always been more than just a store to him. It was the embodiment of his hard work, his vision, and his commitment to his employees and customers. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Reviewing the changes he had put in motion, Jonathan saw the first signs of real progress. HR had already begun the hiring process for 2 new employees to lighten the workload. A structured training program was in development, ensuring that no one would feel thrown into their role unprepared again. The employee recognition program was already gaining traction, with several team members excitedly nominating each other for outstanding work. But beyond the policies and structural improvements, what mattered most was the shift in morale. When Jonathan visited the store later that afternoon, he saw a team that felt valued. Sophie, now with the reassurance of financial support for her grandmother's care, greeted customers with confidence instead of fear. Nate, stepping into his new leadership role, helped a junior employee navigate a tricky customer request. Even Dave, the once disengaged cashier, seemed more present, cracking a joke with a customer instead of staring at his phone. As Jonathan watched them, he realized something important. A business isn't just about profits, efficiency, or numbers. It's about people. No amount of financial success could replace the value of an engaged, respected, and motivated team. Before leaving, he gathered the employees once more. "This isn't just about fixing what was broken," he told them. "It's about building something better. You are the foundation of this store, and I will never forget that again." For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like a real leader again. He had walked into Wilson's Hardware expecting to fix a struggling business. Instead, he found something even more important, a renewed purpose. As he stepped outside, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the storefront, Jonathan smiled. Wilson's Hardware was on its way to becoming more than just a store, again. It was a place where people worked hard, looked out for each other, and took pride in what they did. And that, he knew, made all the difference. The story of Jonathan Wilson's undercover experience at Wilson's Hardware highlights a powerful lesson in leadership. A business is only as strong as its people. Success isn't just about profits. It's about fostering a workplace where employees feel valued, supported, and heard. Toxic management can quietly erode morale, while genuine leadership inspires growth and loyalty. By stepping into the shoes of his workers, Jonathan learned that listening, recognizing hard work, and creating a positive culture are what truly drives success. The best leaders don't just manage from the top, they engage, uplift, and lead with empathy,